The night is quiet now. Let the day fall behind you. Tonight, we drift through candlelight and starlight into the story of a mind that changed the world. Isaac Newton, born in a storm, raised in silence, and drawn always toward the mysteries of motion, time, and the universe itself. Close your eyes, breathe slow, and let us begin at the edge of winter, where a fragile child opened his eyes to a restless world. It was Christmas Day, 1642, in a stone farmhouse in Woolsthorpe, England, while snow drifted silently beyond shuttered windows. Isaac Newton entered the world. His father had died before he was born. His mother, Hannah, was 23, widowed and weary. Outside, England was in civil war. Inside, the cottage flickered with candlelight and prayers. The wind pressed against the shutters, and somewhere, deep in the rafters, the timbers moaned. He was born too soon. So small, they said, he could fit in a quart mug. No one expected him to live. But somehow, through the chill and the storm, he did. His mother watched over him, her hands trembling as she wrapped him in cloth. He lay still, barely moving, his eyes open, watching the flickering shadows on the walls. He survived, barely. The world would come to know him, but on that winter night, he was simply a fragile child, clinging to breath. Hannah rarely spoke of her sorrow, but the loss of her husband and the fear for her son hung like fog in the house. She paced softly, pausing by the window, listening to the storm. Her son's life felt like a delicate thread, stretched between wind and silence. The neighbors whispered. Some said he was cursed, others touched. But Hannah simply watched, held her child close, and hoped. The village outside stood quiet, soaked in rain and uncertainty. These were hard years. Famine, conflict, plague on the horizon. But the farmhouse where Newton was born stood firm through the storm. It became his first universe, its corners, his first boundaries, its firelight, his first star. Beyond the soaked stone walls, the world shifted in war. Inside, a miracle breathed. In the cradle, wrapped in layers of linen, Newton's eyes were wide. Even then, he seemed unusually still, as if the world was already forming questions in his mind. The candlelight danced, and the shadows bent. No one could have guessed that this fragile infant would one day redefine gravity, motion, and the heavens. But in that moment, he was simply waiting, small, silent, and ready to begin. Isaac Newton was a quiet child. He didn't speak much, but he watched everything. The wind especially fascinated him. He'd stand still for long stretches, eyes fixed on how the trees moved, how smoke twisted, how clouds seemed to race each other across the sky. While other children ran and shouted, Isaac observed, wordless, still absorbing every pattern. He began to build little windmills from scraps of wood, water wheels turned by kitchen spills, lanterns with shifting shadows. His hands were small, but precise, his mind already reaching into questions no one around him was asking. He didn't yet know the names of the forces, the laws, or the math. He only knew the wind, and that it moved the world. On rainy days, he would sit by the window for hours, watching the drops trace slow rivers down the glass, noting how they gathered, moved, merged. The house around him bustled with chores and footsteps, but he barely noticed. His gaze drifted outward, following the sky, the fields, and something beyond them, something only he seemed to see. There was a solemnity in him, not sadness, but distance, as if part of him had already moved away from the world of small things, toward something larger. His eyes were pale and watchful, already asking questions long before he had words to form them. The breeze would brush through his hair, and he would barely blink. Some said he was odd, others touched. He began to draw crude diagrams of windmills, wheels, and arcs. He didn't show them to anyone. They were for him alone. A private grammar of motion. He was beginning to shape thought into form. The first flickers of a mind that would one day shape the world. When Isaac was sent to Grantham for schooling, the world opened just a little wider. He lived in the attic of an apothecary's home, surrounded by shelves of glass bottles, herbs, and powders. Though he was meant to study Latin and arithmetic, it was the tools and tinctures that called to him. In quiet moments, he crafted sundials in the garden, etching hours into stone and shadow. No one had taught him. He simply watched the sun and listened. At school, Isaac was reserved. He spoke softly, if at all. While other boys mocked and wrestled, he stayed to the side, careful, observant. He didn't seek attention, but he noticed everything. The way chalk dust floated in sunlight, the rhythm of footsteps in halls, the movement of pendulums, ink trails, and time. His loneliness was deep, but it gave him room to see clearly. By candlelight, he began to build. Small machines, wheels that turned, water that flowed from flask to flask. He created crude clocks, measuring moments in droplets. He took apart lanterns and mirrored them to reflect more light. On his windowsill sat a collection of simple tools, blades, wires, a lens, each one shaped by his hands, each one whispering the first questions of a restless mind. At night, when the streets grew still and the hearths went dim, Isaac would sit by the window. The stars above Grantham seemed closer than the people below. He stared at them not with wonder, but with quiet challenge, as if he believed they had answers he was meant to find. The sky, to him, wasn't a mystery, it was a map. He filled the margins of his notebooks with diagrams, triangles, orbits, arcs, and strange mechanical sketches. He wasn't copying lessons, he was dreaming in geometry. His mind, untrained but searching, began to shape the laws he would later reveal. The world had not yet noticed Isaac Newton, but already he had begun to draw it. After the brightness of Grantham, the farm in Woolsthorpe seemed quieter than ever. Isaac had withdrawn, not out of reluctance, but as if to listen more deeply to the world around him. The wind returned as his companion. The rustle of trees, the lowing of cattle, the distant whistle of air across tall grass, all of it fed his quiet wonder. He spent hours alone in the fields, some days lying on his back, watching clouds drift and split. Other times, crouched near a brook, observing ripples and reflection. It was as if the world spoke in waves and angles, and Newton, still only a boy, listened to learn the grammar of nature. With a stick, he traced shapes in the dirt, circles, ellipses, curves. He saw motion in the dance of leaves and timing in the rhythm of birdsong. He had no equations yet, no words for inertia or velocity, but his mind was reaching, stretching like sunlight over the hills that bordered his family's land. In the barn loft, he built small contraptions, pulleys from string levers, from fence posts. They did nothing useful, but that didn't matter. Each was an idea made visible, a question answered with wood and twine, a small experiment in the hands of a boy no one yet believed would be anything more than a farmer. Evenings came quietly. Isaac, barefoot, would watch the last light fall over the fields. He was a boy in stillness, not lost, but pausing, preparing. The quiet was not empty. it was potential, and the sky, vast and ever-turning, had not stopped speaking to him. In 1661, at the age of 18, Isaac Newton left Woolsthorpe once again, this time not to tend shop or mend fences, but to enter the hallowed gates of Trinity College, Cambridge. The stone walls and echoing corridors were filled with minds far older and more polished than his. But Newton arrived with something rarer, an unshaped fire. He was not an immediate star. He kept to himself, rarely speaking in lectures, rarely dining in the halls. But in the quiet of his room, he read Descartes, Kepler, Galileo, each page another door. He copied entire books by hand, not for memorization, but to absorb the rhythm of thought. His room filled with notes, diagrams, and candles burned low. The university taught him structure, but it was the questions that stirred him most. Why do bodies fall? How does light bend? What lies beyond the moon's pull? He began to write his own ideas in the margins of texts, quiet thoughts that would later become revolutions. At night, he would walk the college gardens, glancing up at the stars, half lost in calculations only he understood. To others, he seemed absent, distracted, but his solitude was not emptiness, it was alignment. He was beginning to find the orbit of his own thought. He kept a list of sins, not of misdeeds against others, but of time wasted, idle hours, unfocused moments. Even then he knew that his time, like his questions, moved in a path he must trace with care. Cambridge had given him tools, but it was his silence that would shape the future. In 1665, the plague reached Cambridge, and the university closed its gates. Newton returned to Woolsthorpe, not in defeat, but in quiet escape. The world fell into illness and fear, but for Isaac, this retreat was not the end, it was the beginning. Alone, surrounded by trees and silence, he began to think more freely than ever before. In the orchard, an apple fell, not with drama, not with revelation, just a moment, quiet and whole. But Newton saw more. He asked not simply why it fell, but why it always fell down. What was pulling it? What rules shaped that pull? Beneath the apple tree, he began to imagine a force that stretched beyond the branches, beyond the clouds, a law that governed both apples and stars. In his small study, the light changed. A beam from a high window split through a prism. It cast colors onto the wall, red, orange, green, blue. But Newton didn't marvel. He measured, he reasoned, he repeated the experiment over and over. He began to understand that light wasn't changed by glass, it was revealed by it. During these plague years, he also began to write strange symbols, fluxions, a new language for change and motion. What would later become calculus was, for him, a private conversation between numbers and nature. Each formula was like a breath drawn slowly, with reverence. He was building not a tool, but a way of seeing. While the world grieved and waited, Newton was still, patient, intent, no acclaim, no audience, just the orchard, the light, and the silent fire of thought. In this solitude, he was not hiding, he was awakening. Alone in Woolsthorpe, Newton's thoughts turned inward. He began to sketch symbols, rules, motions that hadn't yet been named. With no one to impress and no need to publish, he worked in secrecy. He called his system fluxions, a way to describe change, the continuous flowing of one state into another. The mathematics of movement was beginning to take form. His notebooks filled with curves and ratios, with symbols for things that didn't yet have words. At times, He would spend the entire night at his desk, not lifting his head until the sky outside began to pale. His candle burned low, but his mind burned bright, tunneling deeper into the structure of time and space. The method was his alone. He invented it in silence. He tested it by imagining falling bodies, circling moons, pendulums ticking through empty rooms. His equations danced with ideas not yet shared with any soul. He wasn't seeking fame. He wanted clarity, a clear, quiet truth beneath the chaos of motion. In fluxions, he saw not just numbers, but nature itself. A falling leaf was no longer chance. It had a curve. A stream had a flow that could be captured, named, drawn. Newton didn't see beauty in abstraction. He saw it in precision, in being able to grasp the invisible and give it form. And still, he said nothing. These discoveries, these revolutions of thought, he kept them hidden, like seeds not yet ready for sun. He needed more time, and the silence, for now, suited him perfectly. By day, Newton studied the skies and the rules that governed bodies in motion. But by night, under the dim flicker of a single lamp, he turned to older mysteries. Alchemy, not as superstition, but as a secret language of transformation. He believed there was more to the world than what could be measured, and so he searched. His room became a laboratory of smells and shadows. Glass vessels hissed and simmered. Metals were ground and weighed. Ancient texts lined his walls, pages stained with symbols and prayers. He read deeply, not just for knowledge, but for insight. The universe, he thought, might be hiding its truths in metaphor. He melted substances in crucibles, watched reactions bloom like fireflowers, and recorded every glow, every smoke. These were not childish experiments. They were rituals, acts of reverence. He was trying to coax truth from matter, just as he coaxed light from glass. There was faith in this, too. Newton believed God's work was hidden in both the stars and the soil. If gravity governed the heavens, perhaps a purer order governed the elements. Gold from base metal, spirit from substance. His hands were stained, but his purpose was clear. And yet, he told almost no one to the world. He was a scholar, but in secret, he was an alchemist. Not chasing gold, chasing meaning, trying to reconcile science with spirit, seeking a harmony deeper than formulas, a unity the world wasn't ready to see. In a darkened chamber, Newton let a single beam of sunlight enter through a pinhole. It struck a prism and exploded into color, a quiet spectrum on the far wall. Where others saw beauty, Newton saw evidence. The colors weren't created by the glass. They were part of the light itself. He repeated the experiment again and again, moving the prism, narrowing the beam, blocking and bending and recording. His room became a gallery of refracted light, where each flicker spoke a truth. Red bent least, violet most. The order wasn't arbitrary. It was law. From this, Newton wrote his Optics, not a dry manual, but a meditation. He described light as a compound, made of parts, separable, predictable. His findings were met with awe, but also resistance. Not everyone was ready to believe that something as divine as light could be broken down and named. Still, he persisted. He built instruments, lenses and mirrors, tools to tame light. He argued with scholars, defended his views, revised his notes. The boy who once watched clouds now followed rays of light through glass and ink. He was mapping a different sky, What he found in color was more than science. It was a key, proof that nature could be split, examined, and reassembled, that even the most beautiful things, rainbows, flames, dawns, followed rules, and in those rules Newton found peace. In 1672, Newton sent a paper to the Royal Society, his first public offering, a piece on the nature of light and color. The response was swift and mixed. Some praised it, others challenged it. For the first time, his quiet work met the noise of the world, and Newton, no longer a boy, had to decide how much of himself he was willing to share. The Royal Society was no gentle salon. It was a battlefield of ideas, ruled by sharp minds and sharper tongues. Newton found allies, but he also found critics. Robert Hooke, already a prominent figure, took issue with some of Newton's conclusions. Their disagreement would shadow Newton for years to come. Still, his talent could not be denied. He was elected a fellow, invited to lectures. His telescope, a compact reflecting design, earned praise and prestige. He was no longer just a mathematician or a recluse. He was a name in the world of science. And yet, it unsettled him. Public recognition brought more than applause. It brought expectation. Newton felt exposed. His ideas were not meant to be debated in haste. They were delicate, forged in silence. Now they were subject to politics, to reputation, to revelry. But he stayed, and he worked. And slowly, the boy who once watched wind and shadow became a voice among the great thinkers of Europe. His solitude had shaped his vision. Now, the world had begun to see it too. Newton's curiosity with light extended beyond prisms and color. He wanted to build a better instrument, one that could see deeper into the sky. The telescopes of the day were long and unwieldy. He believed mirrors, not lenses, could offer clarity without distortion. And so, quietly, he began to craft one. With tools and polish, he shaped a tiny mirror, metal, curved just right. Mounted in a small tube, it reflected distant light to a focused point. It was a simple object, but it held the heavens. For the first time, the moon came into focus without halo or blur. Craters, sharp, shadows, clean. He didn't rush to display it. He tested, adjusted, waited. But when he finally did submit it to the Royal Society, the response was amazement. It was smaller, clearer, more powerful than expected. This was not just theory. It was proof in brass and glass and polish. The reflecting telescope marked a turning point. It was a symbol, not of fame, but of craft. Newton was no longer just a thinker. He was a builder, a scientist of mind and hands, of theory and tool. His vision was no longer abstract. It could now be held, pointed, and aimed at the stars. And when he turned that small telescope toward the moon, he didn't see myth or mystery. He saw shape, texture, law. The same forces he studied on Earth lived out there too. He had built a mirror, but in it he found something more, a new way to look at everything. Gravity had long been a whisper, a force assumed, not explained. Objects fell, planets circled. But why? Newton had pondered this in solitude, sketching curves and orbits. Now, years later, he began to write it down, not as a question, but as an answer. He imagined the Earth pulling the moon pulling the tides, every object pulling every other, invisible threads stretched between stars and stones. The apple that fell in Woolstarp wasn't just an orchard moment. It was a signpost to the universe. but he hesitated to publish. The ideas were too vast, too raw. Then came Edmund Halley, a fellow scientist and friend. Halley pressed him to share his work, to formalize what he had found. Newton resisted at first, but something in Halley's belief stirred his resolve. He began to write, not essays or theories, a system, law upon law, proof upon proof. He calculated orbits, tides, planetary motion. Gravity was no longer a mystery, it was a formula. And within that formula was a vision of the cosmos bound by elegant force. It would take time before the world understood the scale of what he had done. But Newton already knew. The apple, the moon, the stars, they all moved to the same rhythm. And now, finally, someone had written the music. The writing of the Principia was not a peaceful act. It was a storm. Newton worked furiously, pages piling around him, ink-stained fingers, sleepless nights, calculations that tangled and untangled like vines. He wasn't just explaining gravity. He was rebuilding how humans understood motion, space, and time. He structured the book with intention. Definitions first, axioms, then proofs, theorems, corollaries. Everything carefully stacked like a great cathedral of thought. Each line was tested, sharpened. He wanted the truth to be unshakable, not poetic, but inevitable. Halley stood by him, funding the printing, encouraging the effort. Without Halley, the Principia might have never seen the light. Newton, brilliant and private, needed that steady voice saying, yes, this must be shared. When the book was released in 1687, it did not spread like wildfire. It was too dense, too complex, but for those who could read it, it was like staring into the machinery of the cosmos. Motion was no longer mystical. It was math, predictable, elegant. Across Europe, scientists read, in awe, the planets danced to his equations, the moon obeyed his laws. What had been the realm of gods and myths now had footnotes, and Newton, unknowingly, had changed the world with ink and silence. After the Principia, Newton did not bask in praise. He withdrew. The years of work had drained him, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. He left correspondence unanswered. He no longer walked the same garden paths. Something had changed in him, something essential and quiet. He turned back to his older passions, alchemy, prophecy, scripture. Late at night, he pored over cryptic texts and strange diagrams, seeking meaning in symbols no longer spoken aloud. He scribbled in margins and filled journals with thoughts he never intended to share. In these pages, Newton searched not for fame or clarity, but for the divine blueprint. He believed that the same hand that shaped the heavens had also buried secrets in ancient texts. To find those secrets, he needed solitude, the same solitude that had always been his ally. Some believed he was unraveling, but Newton wasn't breaking. He was deepening, moving inward, toward the roots of his belief, his fear, his longing. He didn't fear the darkness. He studied it. He asked it questions, and he waited for answers. What he wrote in those shadowed years would only surface long after his death. But in that time, Newton remained quiet, composed, deliberate. A mind that had mapped the stars now sought the soul, and though he was silent, his thoughts moved with the same gravity as before. In 1696, Newton stepped into a world far from telescopes and theorems. The Royal Mint, his appointment as warden, surprised many. He wasn't a politician or a soldier, but he brought the same rigor to coinage as he had to the cosmos. He studied counterfeiting not as a crime, but as a system, one he could dismantle. He examined dyes and molds, traced forgery rings, and quietly hunted those who corrupted the currency. This wasn't theoretical work. It was cold, deliberate justice. He interrogated prisoners, visited darkened cellars, and orchestrated arrests. His name carried weight, his silence unnerved. Where others sought bribes or glory, Newton sought precision, order, a system of trust built not on fear, but on accuracy. Behind his office door, charts and records replaced star maps, but the mind was the same, patient, focused, relentless. He believed that even in the messy world of men, there could be law, that even gold could orbit its own kind of principle. Though this chapter of his life was quieter in the public eye, it revealed another side of Newton, one as devoted to integrity as to inquiry. The Mint became his new observatory, the weight of justice his new gravity. Fame brought not just recognition, but rivalry. Newton, once reclusive, now found himself at the center of controversy. His dispute with Robert Hooke burned cold and long, a clash of pride and principle. They had once exchanged ideas. Now each questioned the other's credit and character. Hooke accused Newton of borrowing too freely from others. Newton, in turn, minimized Hooke's role in shared discoveries. Their letters grew sharp. Their patience grew thin. The air between them thickened with distrust. For Newton, the sting of accusation was sharper than public critique. Then came Leibniz, the calculus war. Two men, two nations, claiming the same crown of discovery. Newton's fluxions against Leibniz's differentials. The debate consumed the Royal Society, filled journals, soured friendships. Newton did not simply defend his work, he orchestrated the defense of his legacy. Privately, Newton kept notes. He catalogued every slight, every misquote, every omission. He was no longer just seeking truth, he was guarding it. His mind, once so expansive, turned inward, protective. Paranoia crept into the margins of his brilliance. Yet even in conflict, he remained meticulous. His responses were measured, detailed, rooted in years of thought. The feuds bruised him, yes, but they also revealed the cost of genius, the burden of having seen so far, and the fear that others might steal the view. In his later years, Newton began to wonder not just about the world, but about time itself. What was it, really? A ticking clock, a flowing stream, or something deeper, eternal, divine, touched by the mind of God? These were not problems to solve, but mysteries to reflect upon. He returned to his studies of light, but this time his questions blurred into metaphysics. He wondered about space without bodies, time without motion. His science had expanded the universe. Now it led him toward the infinite. Newton believed in an ordered cosmos, not just mathematically, but spiritually. To him, the laws of nature were the handwriting of God, not symbols of chaos, but proof of intention. He saw divinity in precision, grace in gravity. He spent evenings revisiting the ancients, Plato, Euclid, and prophets. He didn't seek to escape into mysticism, but to connect the truths of heaven and earth. He believed science was not a rival of faith, but its lens. As age softened his resolve, Newton's thoughts turned to questions with no proof. Where does time begin? Can it end? He never claimed to know, but he walked those questions like paths through a twilight orchard, unafraid of the dusk. Old age found Newton still restless, knighted, revered, ensconced in rooms of quiet papers and ticking clocks. But he did not slow. His walks continued, alone, through London gardens, or beneath starlit skies, where city lights could not yet drown the heavens. He would sit for hours in study, not calculating new laws, but rereading old ones, revisiting his own notebooks, wondering if he had missed something, if there was another truth buried between equations and orbits. He kept writing, even when his eyes dimmed. He revised optics, collected thoughts on prophecy, outlined rules for theological harmony. His mind never stopped circling the questions that had haunted him since boyhood: time, light, God, and gravity. Servants noticed he talked to himself more often, sometimes gently, sometimes sharply, as if in dialogue with the universe. He wasn't lonely, not in the usual sense, but he lived in thought now more than in speech. Solitude had become his native language. In his final years, Newton carried the weight of his legacy with quiet resolve. He had climbed so high into knowledge that the ground had long vanished beneath him, and still he searched upward, not for more answers, but for the peace of asking nothing. By the spring of 1727, Newton's body began to falter, though his mind stayed sharp. He spent his final days in London, surrounded by books, letters, and silence. He rarely complained. When he did, it was about the small aches, not the great ones. He greeted visitors with soft civility, and slept more often with the window cracked to the stars. He did not fear death. It arrived gently, like a long-expected visitor. One night, after a quiet dinner, Newton lay down and did not rise again. No drama, no farewell speech, only breath, then stillness. The last exhale of a man who had once mapped the heavens from behind candlelight. The world mourned. Dignitaries and scientists gathered in London. His coffin, heavy with honors, was carried through Westminster Abbey among kings and poets. Isaac Newton was laid to rest, not as a noble, but as a mind that changed everything. They called him the greatest scientist of his age, the one who saw further, who tamed the universe with math. But Newton himself had written it differently. I do not know what I may appear to the world, but to myself I seem to have been only like a boy, picking up pebbles on the seashore. His death was not an end, but an echo, a soft closing chord. His ideas moved on into telescopes and timepieces, into rockets and reason. But in that final moment, Newton left, not with triumph, but with quiet, as he had entered, small, silent, and brilliant. In the decades that followed Newton's death, his shadow stretched long. Scientists across Europe studied his works not just as lessons, but as scripture. His equations echoed in new discoveries. His methods became the foundation for generations of inquiry. He had changed what it meant to ask questions. The laws he uncovered gave rise to inventions: steam engines, machinery, astronomical models. Engineers and philosophers invoked his name. He was not simply a man of his time. He had redefined time itself. His influence moved with the orbit of planets and the ticking of every accurate clock. But Newton's legacy was more than motion and math. It was the belief that the universe could be known, that beneath the beauty and terror of nature there was order, not chaos, not whim, but rules, waiting to be revealed by a steady mind and patient eyes. Einstein would later call him the most fortunate of scientists, for there was only one universe to discover, and Newton had found its secrets first. Hawking would write of standing on his shoulders. Newton had become not just a name in history, but a step in ascent. And so, even now, we look up at the stars through lenses shaped by his hands. We mark time by principles he penned in silence. Newton lives in orbit and pendulum, in prism and fall. In every question asked, at the edge of knowing, his spirit lingers. So now, dear listener, as your eyes grow heavy and the night deepens, let the story of Isaac Newton linger softly. A boy born beneath storm clouds, a mind shaped by silence, a man who reached into the darkness and brought back light. His journey was not one of noise or haste, but of steady wonder, the kind that lives in quiet questions and still hours. May his story remind you that even in solitude, in shadow, and in slow discovery, there is brilliance waiting. Sleep well beneath the stars he once mapped, calm, curious, and cradled by the same gravity he named.